Go ahead, Roger.
Good morning and welcome to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. But as probably most of you know, we don't we no longer meet at the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library in Oakland, California. Since the pandemic, pretty much we've been meeting on Zoom. So good afternoon to our guest, Dan Kovalik in Pittsburgh. And if there's anybody from across the pond, good evening, and welcome to the Marxist Library. We've been doing these programs for 15 years, more or less every weekend, religiously on Sunday morning. These programs are brought to you by the Institute for the Critical Study of Society, ICSS. Our website is ICSS Marx. And we are the people that put on the program, and I'm Roger Harris, and I'm on the program committee. We subscribe to the study of Marxism, and we respect the work of Marx, and we consider his work relevant to today. And our motto is taken from Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, and which is, as probably most of you know, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. But you don't have to be a Marxist to either participate in this program, ask questions, or to be a speaker. So before we start the program, I want to remind everyone that this is a comradely forum. We've worked very hard to develop a culture of comradely respect, exchange of ideas and stuff like that. We don't always have to agree with each other, but we always have to be respectful to each other, to the speaker, to the moderator, and also realize that the opinions expressed are those of the speakers themselves and not necessarily of the Institute for the Critical Study of Marxism or for the, Institute for the Critical Study of Society and the Marxist Library. So our speaker today will give a presentation, and it'll take about 30 minutes. We'll stop for a few announcements, and then we'll have a robust question and answer period, and we'll get back to that in a moment. I am so excited about our speaker today. He's a dear friend and comrade, Dan Kovalik. Dan is a human rights advocate and lawyer, and he just got back from the West Bank of Palestine, and he'll be explaining some of what's happening there and go into some of these historical developments. Dan has written extensively on human rights and U.S. foreign policy, and he's lectured around the world on those subjects and frequently appears on RT and other outlets. He's the author of probably almost as many books that he's written almost as many books recently as I've read, but that's not a coincidence because most of the books that I've read recently are ones that are authored by Dan. Dan's authored books on Venezuela, on Iran, on Russia, on cancel culture. I got that out. And right now, we're looking forward to his latest book, which will probably come out maybe in April, which will be on Israel and Palestine. And I should also add that Dan teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He graduated from Columbia University School of Law, and he has served as the in-house counsel for the previous to that, previous to his retirement, I should say. He had been in-house counsel for the United Steelworkers, AFL-CIO, and he retired from that position in 2019. But since then, he's been super active. And not only that, not just come back from the West Bank of Palestine just a few weeks ago, but right before that, he came back from Cairo, where he tried to be he was part of an international delegation that tried to bring humanitarian aid to Gaza, but was unsuccessful in breaking that blockade. So, Dan, please tell us about all your insights into the situation right now, and if the stage is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's always great to talk to the Marxist Library, and thank you, Roger. You're a dear friend and comrade, and I'm happy to be able to speak today. So I actually just returned from the West Bank really a week ago. And, I decided to go because of what's happening there. I felt like I need to pay witness. As Roger said, I did try to get into Gaza. That's a much harder thing to do at the moment. We're witnessing something very terrible. I think I don't have to tell people that. And I've talked to people who know very well, and there's agreement that this is maybe the worst conflict we have seen in our lifetime, and some of us are older than others. But in fact, Chris Hedges, I talked to in Cairo, he, of course, won the Pulitzer Prize. He was based in Sarajevo during the war. He was stationed in Gaza for a while. He knows of what he speaks about conflict, and we agreed that we've never seen anything like this, in terms of the number of civilians that are dying, at the rate they're dying, the rate that children are dying, the rate that journalists are being killed, the number of journalists killed, the number of UN staff people who've been killed in Gaza, over 130. This is more than in any conflict since the United Nations was created. Over 100 historic sites in Gaza have been leveled. Christian, Muslim, other. The Rafa Museum is now in rubble. This is a catastrophe, and it is a man-made catastrophe, and as is many times the case, it's largely made in the United States, which is funding this war, providing military support for this war, providing diplomatic support, vetoing at least 4 resolutions I know at the Security Council that have called for a ceasefire, even ones that have called merely for the protection of civilians in Gaza. So we cannot afford to turn our eyes away from this, as hard as it is to look, right? So I went to the West Bank. Things are very bad there. The repression, the violence inflicted on the people of the West Bank has increased greatly since October 7th. Around 300 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th by a combination of Israeli military and settlers. Oftentimes the settlers, of course, are accompanied by the military, who stand and watch them engage in violence, in pogroms, in the theft of Palestinian homes, the demolition of Palestinian homes, which has also increased since October 7th, particularly, by the way, in Jerusalem. A number of people told me that Jerusalem is really a target for the violence, for the attempt to speed up the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem. Again, the demolition of homes is increasing there. The settlements are being built at a breakneck pace there. Israel is clearly wanting to use this moment not only to wipe out Gaza, which is clear, but also to gain a greater foothold over all of the West Bank. And of course, a lot of people think that, once they are done with Gaza, that they will turn their full force against the West Bank. Over 3,000 Palestinians have been arrested since October 7th in the West Bank. That adds to the about 5,000 Palestinians already in jails up to that point. So again, that's a staggering number of people. And for every person that the Israelis returned through the hostage swap during the humanitarian pause, they have arrested many more people, many of them children, many of them women, many of them being put under administrative detention, in which case they don't even have to, charge them with anything. They just hold them indefinitely. I talked to a number of people, a number of families who have had young men arrested. I met one family whose young man was arrested last spring from the West Bank. He was returned as part of the hostage swap. So he was held for about 8 months, they said. He was 17 years old at the time. He was arrested. He was arrested from school with a few weeks left before final exams, before, actually graduating from high school, which, by the way, is a very typical thing the Israelis do to break up people's education. When they first arrested him, he was marched 8 miles up a hill, up a mountain, actually, into the Israeli military camp, which is part of a settlement. All the settlements, as you know, almost invariably are at the top of the mountains. And that's where he was marched to. He said that particularly after October 7th, his treatment and the treatment of the other prisoners worsened greatly. They were beaten. All of their possessions were taken. Any radio, TV, they were left with one blanket. They were left after October 7th with only the clothes on their back. All other clothing was taken. So that for weeks, they were just living in the same clothing. They were allowed to shower once a week at that point, and they were given one plate of food per cell per meal. And he had 12 to 13 people in his cell at that point, going up from 6 people before October 7th. So the abuse was huge after October 7th. And he said they were particularly tough on prisoners that they had from Gaza that were there. And he was greatly traumatized by this, of course, and his parents said that. I visited another family. Both of these families, by the way, were in small villages north of Jerusalem and Ramallah. A family whose young son and brother was killed a week before I got there. He was a bystander. About 4 a.m, he was sleeping. His family was sleeping. He heard a commotion outside. He went to see what was happening. He saw that Israeli armed forces were there to arrest another young man. He watched this happen, and while he was simply watching, he was shot 4 times with butterfly bullets, which are illegal. These are the type of bullets that blow up inside you on impact. And the Israelis didn't call for medical help, didn't look to try to resuscitate him. They just took their prisoner and left him for dead. And again, this is what's happening right now in the West Bank on an increasing level. You might have seen the video also of Israeli troops kicking a reporter in the head multiple times, beating him. The savagery is just amazing. Of course, we know of the savagery in Gaza. I visited Bethlehem. I was very lucky to visit Bethlehem while I was there. For someone, a recovering Catholic, it still means something to me to go there to see the birthplace of Jesus. I was one of the only tourists there that, there was no tourists, of course, you could imagine. And of course, you may know that the Christian patriarchs who run the Christian churches in Bethlehem, have literally canceled Christmas this year. They sent a letter to Joe Biden saying they were canceling Christmas because of the brutality in Gaza, that there was nothing to celebrate, there was no lights, there were no trees. You probably have seen that incredibly moving creche at the Lutheran Church in Bethlehem of a doll of representing Jesus on top of rubble. And the priest there said that That is where we will find Jesus, in the rubble. And of course, it's true, and it's moving, and it's sad. By the way, in 2002, you might remember that the Church of the Nativity was shelled by the Israeli forces. This is where at least they claim, the birth of Jesus happened, in a cave where the Church of the Nativity now stands. It was laid siege to by the Israelis for over a month, shelled, snipers fired indiscriminately into the Church of the Nativity, killing people. And this underscores something that I think is important, because, we're often, now obviously I'm talking to the initiated. I'm talking to people who probably have been to the West Bank and other places and know about the conflict, but it's important to remind ourselves, while we are often told this is a Muslim versus Jewish conflict, it's not a real fair statement of what's happening. Of course, there's many Jewish Palestinians. The gentleman who took me to Bethlehem is an interesting guy, in fact, and I think resembles, or is emblematic of, the conflict in many ways. He's Jewish. He was born in what was Palestine then in 1946, before Israel was created. He also had a British citizenship, because remember also that this was a British protectorate before 1948. So he has a British passport and an Israeli passport, but he's actually in the Fatah party in the West Bank, which is the governing party, of course, and is the party of the Palestinian Authority. So he's an interesting character, and he's been calling Israel an apartheid state since 1987, which I think makes him a very early, proponent of that view of it being an apartheid state. He wrote a book about Israel as an apartheid state in 1987, and he bases it on a number of things, but the main thing being that over 90% of the legal rights to land in Israel are designated for people who are Jewish, right, and not for non-Jews. He said that compares much more, that compared to South Africa under apartheid, that is a greater percentage of land designated for one particular group. So he was the right guy to take me to Bethlehem, and I'll explain why. And again, for people who don't know how the apartheid system works in Israel, Palestine, I think it is instructive. So first of all, a Palestinian who's not from Jerusalem, and therefore would not have the yellow Israeli tag on their car, could not have successfully got me to Bethlehem from Ramallah, because they cannot travel freely throughout the area. Their travel's greatly restricted. So only someone with an Israeli plate could have done that for me. But also someone with only an Israeli passport could not have gotten me there, because Bethlehem is in Area A. Under the Oslo Accords, you have Area A, B, and C, and that's now part of Israeli law and international law. Those areas, Area A, which Bethlehem is only for Palestinians. Israelis are not allowed to enter, including the Israeli military, though they violate this all the time, especially now. As they said, essentially every area is Area C now in practicality, which means the Israelis can enter at will. But that is not what the law says. In fact, when you enter Bethlehem, and we entered from the south, by the way, which makes no sense, because Bethlehem is south of Jerusalem and Ramallah, where we came to, but we drove all the way around Bethlehem, which is walled. The Israelis have built one of their ugly walls around Bethlehem in order to avoid check marks to get into Bethlehem, checkpoints. And when you enter, it says this is Area C, or Area A, and Israelis are strictly forbidden from entering, and this is part of Israeli law. But again, that is honored in the breach. But so his ability to have that yellow tag, Israeli tag, and a British passport allowed him to drive me there. By the way, the guy's about 80 years old. I mean, this that he did this for me is incredible. It took us 3 hours to drive there. It took us 4 hours to drive back to Ramallah. It's 18 miles from Ramallah to Bethlehem. That should take 20 minutes to half an hour. But because of the checkpoints, the walls, all this craziness, it took 7 hours there and back. And this is how Palestinians live, right? Again, if they're lucky enough to even be able to travel, their lives are completely inconvenienced by these walls and these gates that make travel ridiculous. It took from Ramallah to Jerusalem, the day I went to Jerusalem, it took an hour and a half to get there. That is an 8-mile drive. That should take 15 minutes even with traffic. It took an hour and a half. And that's because the closest checkpoint to Ramallah was closed because the Israelis closed it so they could invade the refugee camp there. They shot and injured 5 people, killed 1 person, and they also destroyed the goods of the merchants there, mostly food that they just threw out. And again, this is just a daily occurrence. The Israelis also entered Ramallah the morning I was staying there. One morning they entered Ramallah. They shut down a printing store, took the printer from there, the printing press, because it was owned by a political prisoner. Some Palestinians tried to board them off with stones, were unable to do that to protect the printing store. And again, Ramallah is also Area A. The Israelis are not allowed in there, but they come in all the time. And these particular Israeli troops come from a base up at the settlement, which you can see on the hill. And they come, they do their whatever they do, arrest people, shoot people, again, in this case, shut down a Palestinian business, and then they leave. Actually, the building that I stayed in is owned by a very good friend of mine named Amal, beautiful person, and her husband, Mohammed, who were both arrested and deported for a time during the first Intifada. And that building that I stayed at had been invaded by Israeli troops about a month before I got there. They arrested a young man from there. They shot and killed 2 people in the process, and shot at a reporter who I met as well on their way out of town, just kind of randomly. They saw him at the top of a building, and he was filming with his film crew, which he believes they clearly saw, and they just shot up at him. And he could have been killed. Luckily, the glass in front of him protected him. But in any case, this is just a daily occurrence for people. But getting back to my first reflection about this not being a religious war, Christians are being persecuted too by Israel. In the West Bank, but also in Gaza, they blew up the third oldest Christian church in the world in Gaza, killing a number of Christians inside. You might have seen news from this morning. They entered the Holy Family Chapel and killed, executed a couple of Palestinians in there. Again, all sorts of history and antiquities and historic sites, whether they be Muslim or Christian or other, are being destroyed, and Jews are being beat up too by the Israelis if they oppose the occupation. And in fact, we know of the 3 Israeli hostages who were shot and killed by Israeli forces in Gaza. Even though they had white flags, and even though one started to speak in Hebrew to let the Israeli forces know, hey, I'm with you, and they shot him anyway. A similar thing happened in the West Bank when I was there. There was a confrontation between actually a Jewish Israeli, and some Palestinians. The Israeli military came in. They ended up shooting the Israeli by mistake, but not on mistake, because the rules of engagement are they just shoot everyone in sight, and they killed the Israeli even though he had his hands up, and even though he was speaking Hebrew. So the what's happening is incredible. All human rights and international humanitarian law are being violated at will by the Israelis, and again, with the full support of the United States. Joe Biden keeps saying things like, "Oh, well, I've been telling Netanyahu, you got to stop killing so many civilians." And I think he even said something to the extent that, we're just, Netanyahu and I were, we're not on the same page here. And yet he continues to send military aid. He continues to get that $14 billion aid package passed. Biden has been working behind the scenes in an unprecedented way to remove all human rights restrictions on U.S. munitions and weapons reserves so that Israel can tap into those regardless of their human rights compliance, which, of course, is nil. This is unprecedented that a president has done that. So Biden can say anything he wants about trying to encourage the protection of civilians in Gaza, but meanwhile, he continues to arm Israel. Moreover, he just sent 2,000-pound bombs to Israel to use in Gaza. 2,000 pounds. So that's a ton. Just to give you some perspective on that, U.S. military leaders in Afghanistan said they didn't want to use 500-pound ton bombs because they're so indiscriminate, particularly on an urban population, as is in Gaza. Now we're using 2,000-pound bombs that Biden is sending in the middle of this conflict and saying that he cares about civilians. These bombs are wiping out entire neighborhoods in moments. So there's no hiding that the U.S. can have from this conflict. They are part of it. They are part of what I believe and many believe to be a genocide in Gaza. Their hands are all over this. The Center for Constitutional Rights has sued the Biden administration, accusing them of being a party to genocide, which, the U.S. is a party to the Genocide Convention of 1948, the oldest modern human rights law since the founding of the United Nations, which means that convention is part of U.S. domestic law under the under the supremacy clause of the U.S. Constitution. And so the Biden administration is bound by that, and yet they're violating it in an extreme way. So yes, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Again, the West Bank is not being spared during this time. And the mood in the West Bank is very somber, of course. Most of the people I was with were not going out to restaurants. They did not want to go out and celebrate or appear to be celebrating in any regard because of what's happening, particularly in Gaza. The friend I was staying with, her daughter's getting married, I think in a couple weeks. Actually, this upcoming week. Their wedding was canceled. They are going to get married, but with just a few people. They canceled the wedding they'd spent the money on because they don't feel they can have these types of celebrations while these crimes are being committed, and I think, that was pretty profound for me, the amount of sympathy. Meanwhile, it should be pointed out that the Palestinian Authority, which is in charge of the West Bank, ostensibly, has been itself suppressing pro-Gaza rallies and protests. They are sadly a collaborator with Israel, and most of the Palestinians see it that way. They've really betrayed the cause of the Palestinian people, and because of that, there aren't many protests in the West Bank, though people do want to protest and have had some, but the Palestinian Authority is playing a role in violently suppressing them. So that's something else that people have to realize. I'm sure many of you do realize that, but you probably have heard that Biden and I think Netanyahu both, at least at one point, suggested putting the Palestinian Authority in charge of Gaza when this is over, which is never going to happen. The people of Gaza would never have it, but it shows how much what they think of the Palestinian Authority, and that is that they carry out the will of Israel and the United States in the West Bank. I guess those are my thoughts in chief. I could say more, but I'm sure you have questions, comments, and other things. Those are my general reflections of the trip. I'll just say I felt very lucky to get in and out of the West Bank. And a lot of the people I saw said, how in the hell did you get in here? I went to Amman, Jordan, and went by land across the Dead Sea, across the King Hussein Bridge, where you have to go through both Jordanian and Israeli customs. And I was told by Max Blumenthal, is the worst Israeli customs site for people to try to get in like me. And I said I was on a Christian pilgrimage, which was not untrue, but it wasn't the full truth. Though I did tell an untruth by saying I was staying in Jerusalem. I was told, do not say you're staying in Ramallah. If they find out you're staying in the Palestinian areas, they may not let you in at all. So I was lucky to get in and to get out. Again, I'll just end by saying, again, some things I didn't know. I should know these things. I didn't know. My friend Amal took me to some of the gates around Ramallah, and she said, Dan, they can shut these gates on a moment's notice and just lock us in here. They can lock down all of Ramallah. They can lock down all of Bethlehem. And they did for the first 3 weeks after October 7th. All of Ramallah was locked down. Now, to be locked down in Ramallah is not the worst thing. It's a major city. You got hospitals, you have, social services. But if you're in a village that's locked down, you may not have a hospital to go to. And you can't leave to go to the hospital. Women will go to that gate on the verge of having a child, and they are not allowed out. Women will have children in their car at those gates. Women will lose children at those gates. It's an extraordinary thing. The amount of control that Israel, has over these people in the West Bank. We know that they do in Gaza, but it's true in the West Bank as well. So that really was driven home to me in a big way while I was there. So, okay. I hope that was helpful. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions and field any comments.
Dan, that was more than helpful. So thank you very much. And we're going to pause right now for announcements, and then we'll get right back to the Q&A, because what you've raised is something that I'm sure everybody here wants to comment on and hear more about what's happening. Next 2 weeks at the Marxist Library, we're going to be closed for the holidays. Coming back, we're going to have someone, actually, Dan, someone that you know is Jerry Condon, who was in Cairo with you.
Yes, I love Jerry. Great guy, my hero.
Jerry will be accompanied by his partner Helen Jacquard. So they'll be at the library Sunday morning on January 7th, and I hope you can join us then. Helen and Jerry have just completed a 15-month odyssey down the Mississippi, across the Gulf of Mexico, onto Cuba, up the eastern coast of the United States, through the inland waters of the United States, and back to the Midwest. They did this on the Veterans for Peace boat called the Golden Rule. It was a journey to publicize anti-nuclear sentiment. They were extremely successful. They met people across the United States and had a chance to speak to people, find out what they're thinking as well. So Helen and Jerry will be telling us a little bit about the journey of the Golden Rule next January 7th. And they'll also talk about how to build a peace movement, because particularly Jerry has been instrumental as one of the leaders of the peace movement. He's the previous president of the Veterans for Peace. He's now still on the Veterans for Peace um, board of directors, and he's very active in the Peace in Ukraine coalition. So looking forward to that program. But let's get back to Dan. And just to summarize, what's happening right now, it's not a war, it's a massacre. And it's not simply an Israeli action, but it's an action of US imperialism joined at the hip with Zionism. And it's not just against a particular political organization called Hamas, it is against a people, the Palestinians. So with that, I would invite people to raise their hand, and I'll try to call people more or less in the order I see them. And I'm getting myself into gallery view, and you have 2 minutes to make a comment or question, and then give Dan a chance to respond. And I see Sharon Rose's hand up. Please unmute yourself, and the floor is yours, followed by Jean Rule.
Thank you, Dan, for the eyewitness account. I have a comment and a question. So my comment has to do with discussing, bringing it back home and discussing how we're building a movement or supporting the movement for a ceasefire and the change of US policy, which you explained. But before we get to that, I was wondering if you encountered any settlements or settlers. There are 750,000 now. There were about 150,000 settlements when, people there when sometime early on when Netanyahu first became prime minister. So it's under his watch that the settlements just ballooned. And when U.S. politicians when U.S. politicians say blah 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 two-state solution, they're not dealing with the fact that you can't have a two-state solution when you have Bantustans of little Palestinian enclaves surrounded by Israeli settlers who are running around killing more people and grabbing more land every day. So that's my question. But then I hope we can talk more about what's going on here. I've been in many arguments and settings. People know that I'm active in the Democratic Party locally in 2 different clubs. And there's an ongoing dialogue with Israel supporters and also in general, people calling anything that's anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic. And it's been interesting here in Oakland how that's unfolded.
Yeah, that's obviously a big issue. And you know what, well, I'm writing a book, so I've been thinking about, first of all, just to start where you ended on the claim of anti-Semitism, and I thought about a few answers to that, first of all, one of the things, because I do have a section on persecution of Palestinian Christians, which I think for an American audience is important. And of course, I will discuss the fact that there are these right-wing Christians that support Israel because they believe that if Israel, obtains full dominion over Jerusalem, that Jesus is going to come back and murder everyone. And what I'm going to say about that is I believe that's bad religion. That's a heretical view of Christianity that's bizarre and that I reject. And what I was going to, what I'm going to say is the fact that I'm critical of that sect, if you want to call it, of Christianity, doesn't make me anti-Christian, right? But that's not even a good analogy, because being critical of Israel is not even being critical of the Jewish religion. It's more like, I think the better analogy is, if you were critical of the Holy Roman Empire right after Rome adopted the Catholic faith is the official faith of the Roman state, being critical of the Holy Roman Empire doesn't make you anti-Catholic or anti-Christian, and no one would seriously argue that point. And that's the better analogy, right? Being critical of a state that happens to be a Jewish state is not anti-Semitism. And obviously there's a lot, we all know there's so many Jews that oppose Zionism and oppose the Israeli state, but it's such a red herring, but it's an effective one in people's lives and their well, you know, their livelihoods are being destroyed. But I think that is a retort to it. I like that. It's also like, hey, if you criticize the Islamic Republic of Iran, are you anti-Muslim? That's a good analogy too. It's silliness. It's absolute silliness. And again, there's Jews being beat up in the West Bank because they oppose Zionism. You know, so I think again, the idea of worshiping a state, a religion worshiping a state, is just such a to me, objectively wrong course for any religion. And it happens in every religion. It happens in India too, with Hinduism, which, again, radical Hinduism, which can manifest itself in fascism and anti-Muslim violence, no one abides by. No one's going to say, oh, if you don't like Modi, you're anti-Hindu. That's complete nonsense. So that's my 2 cents on that. Anyway, I hope that gives some people some ammunition against that argument. Yes, I saw a number of settlements. I did not witness settler violence, but I saw the result of it. I was very lucky. I had very nice, wonderful people who took me on tours of the various places I was at. A Palestinian who's a Jerusalem resident and a human rights advocate took me around Jerusalem, and he took me to a number of places that have been recently demolished. They're just a parking lot now, literally. They were homes of Palestinians recently demolished. Across the street, there's more neighborhoods that are going to be demolished. Meanwhile, also across the street was a home that had a bunch of Israeli flags on it, and he said that's where some Israelis just took over a Palestinian home, took it over for themselves. And again, he showed me a number of spots like that. And he showed me a neighborhood that had a beautiful park and homes. He said, this is going to be demolished. And had a fence around it with Israeli police. And again, it was being marked for demolition. The other interesting thing is, he drove me through some of the Israeli settlements after we drove through the Palestinian neighborhoods. And the Palestinian neighborhoods were run down, poor, had poor garbage collection, there's garbage everywhere. And then you go up to the Israeli settlements in Jerusalem. If you were blindfolded and brought there, you would think you were on the Gold Coast of Chicago. The incredible shopping centers, the streets are immaculate, and the parks are immaculate. And all these people they all pay taxes, right? And by the way, none of them are now going to the Palestinian Authority. The Israelis are supposed to split the taxes with the Palestinian Authority, especially the custom taxes. I don't know how it all works, but when people come through customs, you pay a customs tax. All that is supposed to be split between Israel and the Palestinian Authority for the good of the people living in the West Bank. And now Israel, for a number of months, is not giving any of those taxes to the Palestinian Authority. None. The people I know who are working for the Palestinian Authority haven't been paid for 4 months. Okay, so the Palestinian Authority, meaning the Palestinian people who depend on the services from the Palestinian Authority, are being starved by Israel. Again, and again, meanwhile, the Israeli settlements are beautiful. They have their own metro systems, these trains, these trolleys that run on these electric tracks that connect all the Israeli settlements. They have expressways now, and he drove me over one that go over a Palestinian neighborhood. So they don't even have to go through the neighborhood. They can go over it. And they don't have to deal with all these checkpoints. They don't have to deal with all this nonsense, right, that the Palestinians have to deal with. And that is the West Bank, and that's Jerusalem in particular has the worst of that. So interestingly, again, the guy, just to show you how absurd and ridiculous this apartheid system are. So because he was born in Jerusalem and has Jerusalem residency, this Palestinian who took me around Jerusalem, he is able to travel fairly freely with he has a yellow license plate. So that's why he could get me through the Israeli settlements. But he's not allowed into Old Jerusalem. Unless you live in Old Jerusalem, a Palestinian can't go in Old Jerusalem anymore. This is where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, the third most holy site for Muslims. This is where the Holy Sepulchre, where the body of Jesus was buried, is at. So this is some of the most holy sites for Christians and Muslims. Palestinians can't go in there unless they happen to have been born and live in there. Okay, so this guy, even though he's a Jerusalem resident, can't go into the old city. I mean, this is incredible what's happening there. The other thing you'd probably know about, so in one of the villages I was at, they showed me an Israeli settlement that's being built and an industrial park right next to it. Again, these tend to be all on the top of the mountains. And the Palestinian villages and cities are below. And in this case, and it's often the case, the Israelis, though they could manage their sewage and their waste in a different way, they allow their sewage and waste to go down into the Palestinian villages to destroy their water supplies, to pollute their villages. It's really, it's awful. It's awful what these settlements do. And as you say, and Chomsky has been saying this for years, you mentioned the Bundesstans, there's no viable second state for the Palestinians, and that was by design. It wasn't till the Oslo Accords were agreed to, which agreed to a two-state solution, that all these walls were put up, all these gates were put up, that Gaza was disconnected from the West Bank, right? People told me they could drive to Gaza in half an hour before, right? All of this apartheid walls and all that all came into being after Oslo, and it was done to prevent a two-state solution, to leave the Palestinians with no contiguous land between Gaza or the West Bank, or even within the West Bank, from which to build a state. And that is now impossible. And by the way, when people say that it's anti-Semitic to do the chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, it's BS, because the Oslo Accords that the Israelis agreed to did contemplate a contiguous Palestinian state, which would have allowed connection between the West Bank and Gaza. That would hook up the river to the sea, right? But again, it was Israel's own policies, intentional policies, which have prevented that. And of course, now we don't know what Gaza is going to look like, right? We have no idea what kind of area they're going to try to shove all the Palestinians into there. And we know what they want to do is push all the Palestinians out of Gaza into the Sinai Desert of Egypt. Now, the Egyptians say they will sacrifice millions of soldiers to prevent that. They're not going to let that happen, but we'll see. But again, that would be a further deterioration of any chance to have a real state, Palestinian state. So most of the Palestinians, not all, but most of the Palestinians that I know and work with believe and are now advocating for a one-state solution, and that is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, one-person, one-vote state. I know that's a crazy idea. There's another country called the United States of America that tried it, never worked. No, I'm kidding. It's what we believe in, right? A pluralistic society, truly democratic society. Now, that's not going to be easy to obtain, just like it has not been easy for the U.S. to obtain because of its own history of settler colonialism and slavery. But, I think in all fairness, we've at least made progress towards that ideal over time through protests, through a civil war, through legal changes. We had our own apartheid state called Jim Crow. In fact, the South African apartheid was based on Jim Crow, which also means the Israeli state apartheid, which was based in South Africa. Apartheid, which is in turn based on Jim Crow, was based on Jim Crow. That was eradicated. That's what's going to have to happen. Edward Said, and you can find this op-ed from the New York Times from 1999, the great Edward Said was advocating for a one-party state back in 1999. In fact, his article is called A One-Party State from the New York Times, 1999. And he was saying back then that Israel had destroyed the two-state solution. So this is not a novel idea, but I think that is probably going to be what makes sense. But in any case, that is where the debate's going to be now. And the other problem is, let's face it, certainly the government as it is in Israel does not advocate a two-state solution. They're openly saying they're opposed to that. So it's not even like that's on the table for the Palestinians. So anyway, that's a long way to answer your question, Sharon, but those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Dan. So next up on the stack is Gene, followed by Raj, followed by Richard Wright. Gene Rule, it's yours.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks so much, Dan, for this. I lead a kind of sheltered life here in Oakland. I live about a mile from the Marxist Library, and the things are relatively quiet here, but I really do appreciate your perspectives and bringing back this information for us stay-at-homers. So again, thank you for that. And also want to mention that I'm wearing my Veterans for Peace cap here. And I'm really proud to be, I do so proudly because Veterans for Peace has come out very strongly in support of the ceasefire. And first of all, we have a statement, an immediate ceasefire and justice for Palestinians and an end to U.S. military, financial, and diplomatic support. So that's one thing we've come out for, and I appreciate. The other thing I just want to remark is, one of the reasons the United States is providing this support is that's what we've done here in the United States. I mean, is there anything that Israel is doing that the United States has not already done to Native Americans here in the United States, as well as you mentioned, Black people here? So I just wanted to say that and say, is there any difference that you could see?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I would say the answer is no, except that Israel has not completed the process that the U.S. was able to complete, which was the complete the complete dominion from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which it has now, which meant the mass murder of indigenous people through violence, through disease. Yes, and all that's being inflicted by Israel upon the Palestinians. The only difference is they haven't completed that process yet, whereas the U.S. largely has. And that's what makes it, I think, a thing of urgency for people living in the 21st century. I mean, we know, looking back, that what the U.S. did to the Native Americans was wrong, was evil. And we have this view that we've progressed beyond that sort of thing, right? But what we're seeing in Israel is exactly what you said. We're seeing right now, in real time, Israel doing exactly what we did to the Native Americans. And that is why we have to stop it. We can't allow that to happen again. And Israel understands in the same way that the U.S. does. By the way, I mean, there, as you say, there's a lot of commonalities here. Even to this day, the U.S. would like you to believe that the Native American problem, such as it is, has been solved, and to the extent that they'd like you to believe there aren't any Native Americans left, which of course isn't true. There's many Native Americans left. There's still Native American territory. Again, their territorial rights are honored in the breach, but they exist. In fact, you know, the Supreme Court, even a conservative court a few years ago, ruled that half of Oklahoma is Indian territory, right? Including Tulsa, I think. Now, again, what does that mean, and what's the U.S. going to do about it? Probably nada. But the point is, I mean, even in the U.S., that struggle is not over, right? And that's important to remember, because again, in Israel, they'd like you to, that what Israel's tried to convince the world is that the Palestinians never existed, right? And they never had a history. And you'll hear that often. And in fact, you know, there's the saying, a people without a land without a people. Right? The myth is that Jews were people without a land, and I'm not going to argue about that particular claim. I think that's more complicated. But the second part is that they therefore went to a land without a people. That's a lie. That there were people there, right? And 700,000 to 900,000 Palestinians were violently displaced in the formation of Israel in 1948. And they had cities, they had a developed economy. That the Israelis want you to think was not true. And what they would like to do, though, now is create that situation of a land without a people. They want to totally destroy not only the Palestinian people as a people, which is genocide, they want to destroy any remembrance of them. And that's why they're destroying ancient mosques, and that's why they're destroying ancient churches, even Christian churches, because the Palestinians were the first Christians. Every Palestinian I know, even if they're a devout Muslim, is proud of the Christian heritage of the Palestinians. They're proud that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's why the Israelis need to wipe out that history. And that's why we have to defend that history. That's human history. That's important history. Even if you're an atheist, that's part of who we are as a people. And that's what they're trying to wipe out, because they don't want you to remember that. And not just in Israel is that happening, or Palestine. It's happening in Syria and Lebanon. And can I go on about that? By the way, excuse me, I have a very bad cold, and it's from all my travels. But I am agreeing to any talking invitation that is given to me, because if the Palestinians can't rest, I'm not going to rest. I'm going to keep talking about this stuff. So excuse my cold. I was blown away when I went to Syria. Roger, were you on that trip in 2021 in Syria, in May 2021? I know Rick Sterling was. But again, I learn things all the time. You think you know everything, and of course, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know squat. But one place we went to in Syria was Malula, which is one of the last cities on earth that speaks Aramaic, the language of Jesus Christ. And there's an ancient church there, one of the oldest churches in the world. And in 2013, the U.S. and Israel-backed Free Syria Army, we were told were moderate rebels, invaded Malula, and they tried to destroy those churches, and they kidnapped some nuns, and they wanted to wipe out all of the Christian heritage of Malula. Again, because this is critical to the plan of the U.S. and Israel to wipe out this history so as to make way for greater Israel, which would take over these lands. Of course, Palestine used to be part of Syria. So was Lebanon. So was Jordan in greater Syria. So they're wiping out these sites there. But really what blew my mind, because I didn't know a lot about Hezbollah when I went there, to be honest, was that it was Hezbollah, along with the Syrian army, that defended Malula, defended the Christians in Malula, saved those nuns. Because the resistance, which Hezbollah represents part of the resistance, is pluralistic. And that's an interesting thing that I didn't get until I went to Malula. And Israel and the US are anti-pluralistic. They want, look, what if they had their druthers, they'd wipe out all those historic sites like they did in Iraq too. And they would basically turn these places into a parking lot, though hopefully lined with McDonald's and Starbucks. I mean, part of what's happening is also this capitalist, the desire, this incessant voraciousness of capitalism to take over everything, right? And that also means to eradicate culture and language and other things so that we have, again, just a giant shopping center in the world. And it is very interesting to see a group like Hezbollah that's saying, no, 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 we're even going to defend the Christians. And they did that in Lebanon too. So, I mean, things like that have just blown my mind over the years. You know, like, again, when you think you've seen it all. And the same thing happened in Homs. I visited Homs, Syria too. And there's an old church there from 59 AD, 59 years after Christ, that again, the Free Syrian Army tried to destroy. And again, Hezbollah and the Syrian army defended it. So things are not always as they appear to. But again, if you look at this as a struggle of imperialism and of capitalism, it totally makes sense. Those ancient things have no value in capitalism. And again, they're an impediment. And I could get into this deeper, but Chomsky's talked about this too. And I'm very interested in this idea that capitalism's very offended by and very against the, primitive forms of Christianity, which were communal, in fact, communistic, that's an abomination for capitalism, and that they want to wipe all that out. They don't mind Jesus is the destroyer. That's fine. That works out fine with capitalism. They don't like Jesus the commie. That's not good for business, right? So that kind of Christianity they are still bent on wiping out. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that. I don't even know how I got started on that. But and again, these are things I'm thinking about for my book. And it does relate to the US violent destruction of liberation theology in Latin America, represented best by the murder of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, but many priests were killed during that time. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. I'm throwing a lot at you. I'm having a little stream of consciousness here, but that's how I do things.
It's very helpful, Dan, and really,
Thank you.
I appreciate it, but I assume everybody else does. On the stack now is Raj Sahai, Richard Wright, Sharat Lynn, Donna Wallach, and Janet Coburn. So, Raj, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Dan, for your talk today, which has come out from your visit, a difficult visit to a place that is under a great deal of transformation taking place, the war. Now, as I see it, Israel is dependent for its survival on the United States, and the United States is dependent on its imperialist survival in the Middle East for control of oil on Israel. So that is why, no matter who is the president, this fact will not change. About the struggle of Palestinians, they cannot be destroyed like the Native Americans were destroyed as a people, because it's not that 400 or 500 years ago that you could do to people. It is the 21st century. And even in the 20th century, the Nazis could not destroy Jews, and therefore Israel, which I think is acting after October 7 more like the Nazis, not just simply a apartheid state, but it is in a sense more parallel to Nazism, is trying to actually reduce the Palestinian people as a non-people. Now, in the West Bank, they have managed to do that to the state, and the people there haven't overthrown their state, and they have accepted it. And in Gaza, which is being run by militant Hamas, and that now Israel is trying to destroy Hamas. There's no way they will destroy Palestinian liberation spirit. On the other hand, Israel cannot but exist as a Jewish state, and which means supremacy of one set of people, as a racist, basically racist state, because they don't accept equality. And there are more Palestinians if you combine Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. So the question I have for you is, how do you see a resolution coming out? I don't see how this can be resolved in any way until the US power is unable to protect Israel, until Israelis themselves are unable to act as overlords and therefore have to compromise with Palestinians. I don't see how this can be resolved. And if it is not resolved, that means enormous bloodshed and probably a greater war. So please comment on this as you think about it, as you have thought about it. So that's my question to you.
Well, it's a great question. And obviously, if I totally knew the answer to that, I would, I'd be doing a lot better in life than I am. But I have some ideas about it. I mean, first of all, I think that what you're seeing at the moment in Israel and in the world vis-a-vis Israel is a tectonic shift. That is, Israel, again, as I said, was based on this lie of a land without a people. I'm sorry, people without a land, because the Palestinians were there. And it's been based on this lie that Israel is somehow this democratic country with the most moral army. They say that all the time, the most moral army in the world. And, and all these things were just not true, okay? But a lot of the world believed it to be true, including a lot of Jews and young Jews who would flock to Israel believing those things. I think that those lies are now exposed. I think people, not everyone, but a large group of people in the world, including young Jews, are seeing that this is a lie and that this is not something they want to be part of. And Israel depends on immigrants to Israel to continue to thrive. They're not reproducing at a great rate. The Palestinians are reproducing at a much greater rate. They know that. They have a demographic problem that they've always been struggling with there. And this problem's going to increase. 500,000 Israeli settlers have left Israel since October 7th. 500,000, that's out of 10 million people. If my math's correct, that's 5% of the population left like that. Hundreds of thousands of other Israeli settlers in both the north and south and on the periphery of Gaza are now internally displaced because of this conflict. So let's say maybe another 500,000. That's 10% of the population. And again, you're not going to have a huge influx of new recruits to Israel because, one, again, many, especially young Jews, do not see this as a good thing, what's happening. And also, Jews of all ages don't see that, oh, this is a safe haven anymore, right? Because they can't protect people there. I think that the weight of all that will undermine Israel fatally, if not in the short term or medium term, but in the long term. I just think that it will not be able to perpetuate itself. It's been very hard for Israel to perpetuate itself as it is. And now it's going to become even more difficult. And so I do think that will lead to the necessity to make some sort of rapprochement with the Palestinians. Again, that may be in the long term. And yes, it may mean that there's going to be a lot of bloodshed in the meantime. It could mean that Gaza is almost totally destroyed in the meantime. I mean, that we're seeing that happen before our very eyes. And that's why the demand for a ceasefire is so critical, because we can't allow that bloodshed to go on. I mean, it's hideous what's happening. And you're right. Look, they're not going to destroy all of the Palestinian people, just like not all of the Native Americans have been destroyed. Not any. It's rare that any particular people's been totally wiped out, though it has happened at times in human history. Of course, the Native Americans in South America, for example, some of those tribes are gone, and many tribes in North America are gone too, but not all the tribes are gone. But a lot could be destroyed in Gaza. So there's a few components to genocide, which, if you don't mind me going through very quickly, are important. You know, the killing of a group, the killing of members of the group, that's happening in Gaza. Of course, the injury, severe injury to members of the group, including mental injury, is happening. I think it's fair to say every last Palestinian in Gaza has been mentally injured in a severe way, given the violence they're witnessing and seeing. Also making, destroying, I forget what the exact words are, but destroying things necessary for life for those people: water, food, medicine, all that's happening. Now it's agreed that over half the population of Gaza is starving. And that is going to increase, and disease is going to increase. So you could have massive mortality amongst the Palestinians. But there's also a fourth component in the Genocide Convention, which is the forced transfer of children from their group to another group. And this is happening also. So the latest statistic I saw is 20 to 30,000 Palestinian children are now orphans. I think you're going to see that number go up incredibly. What's going to happen with those orphans? Are they going to end up with Palestinians? Are they going to end up being adopted outside the group in the West, which happens a lot? I think that is resulting in the forced transfer of children from one group to another. Tens of thousands. By the end of this, maybe hundreds of thousands. And what mental state are those children going to be in? When you see those kids in those videos shaking from having their homes bombed, what kind of people are they going to be? How functional are these folks going to be? The fact is, Israel is destroying a society as we speak. And it may not be the full eradication, physical elimination of the population that Hitler thought of in the final solution, but it is approaching that. And I think that has to be grappled with. How this is going to play out, again, I wish I knew. I wish I had the answer to it. But I certainly think the solution to this humanitarian crisis, the beginning of it, is a ceasefire as soon as possible to stop this bloodshed. And I do think some, move towards this pluralistic state has to happen. How we get there, I wish I could answer that question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Richard Wright. Richard.
Yep, thank you. I had a couple questions, points, whatever. Earlier on your talk, you talked about that there were 3,000 arrested since October 7th. And there were 5,000 that were arrested apparently before that were in the jails before that. Which brings me to the point that we've sort of set the timeline here as October 7th. And we failed to look at what was going on before October 7th, the amount of killing, the amount of the settlement disruption, and what have you. And now we're focusing on, quote, the war against Hamas, which of course has nothing to do with the West Bank, or that I'm aware of. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
Right. No, that's correct. Yeah.
The second thing, so I was just wondering how do we adjust the timeline? How do we get back? How do we focus on what was going on before October 7th that led to this whole thing to begin with? But the other question that I had was, could you go a little bit into the political formations that are active in the whole area, in Israel and in Palestine, and whether we have what fraternal relations we have with them, and just what are the ties that the United States have with those political formations, if anything? Thank you.
Sure. So, look, I agree with you that the October 7th as a beginning point of history is obviously not true and cannot be true. And I think that, in any discussion about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we have to talk about the roots of this conflict going back not just to 1948, but even back, to 1917. When the first, when Britain and the U.S. first started talking about creating a Zionist state there. And I think, obviously the what's happening in Gaza and West Bank now lends itself to that discussion because, as you say, this didn't come from nothing. The violence that happened on October 7th did not come from nothing. And we need to talk about the Nakba of 1948. And about the violence against the Palestinian people since that time, which has been, extreme. And the violence against Lebanon, which is part and parcel of that as well, which, in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp in Lebanon, which before October 7th, probably had the biggest massacre against Palestinians since the Nakba. And I think we just need to discuss that. I think your question, kind of answers itself. We have to talk about the roots of October 7th and can't pretend that history started then. And that's what, of course, the U.S. and Israel want us to believe, that, October 7th came out of nowhere and that it somehow justifies what's happening against the Palestinian people right now, which it does not, of course. In terms of the political formations, first of all, I'm not an expert on that. What I will say is that there is a communist party in Israel. It's very small now. There used to be a real strong Israeli left. We all know that. In fact, the first founders of Israel considered themselves socialists. Now, of course, there was always a tension, to say the least, between socialism and Zionism, right? Because it's a racist. Zionism is a racist philosophy. You can't, they used to be critical of socialism in one state. You certainly can't have socialism for one race of people. That's absurd, right? But there was a real strong social Zionist, labor Zionist movement, though that's largely gone. And the Communist Party's now withered away to almost nothing. The right wing is firmly taken over Israel. There's just not much of a left there. In part because the world also, the left really suffered a great defeat after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that impacted Israel as much as anywhere. But also because as the countries drifted towards the right, a lot of the leftists have just left Israel, right? And new leftists are not coming in. If you're a leftist, who in the God's green earth would move to Israel at this time, unless you were there to burrow from within or something like that. But there are some leftists in Israel that you could work with, and of course there is a left wing in the West Bank that's oppositional to the Palestinian Authority, that believes the Palestinian Authority is a collaborationist party and wants to move towards a more leftist position. Some of that left is, of course, has more of a kind of radical Islamic bent, and some is a secular bent. And those are the people I tend to work with in the West Bank, a left-wing secular movement. And there is a movement there we can and should work with. I think in Gaza that exists too, but I mean, I think Hamas has become so dominant. But of course, there's a number of militant groups fighting with Hamas right now. It's not just Hamas, it's fighting. And it'll be interesting to see how politically all that manifests itself. I think, from what I've in discussing with people, I think the feelings about Hamas are at best conflicted in even in Gaza now, because a lot of Palestinians in Gaza think October 7th was a mistake now that they're seeing what the result of that is, right? I mean, no one anticipated, I don't think Hamas anticipated this kind of massacre that is happening in Gaza. And a lot of Palestinians now, while they might have been celebratory about October 7th just because it was the Palestinians hitting back in a way, I think now a lot wonder if that wasn't a horrible decision. And certainly in the West Bank, there are some supporters of Hamas there, and I met some, but I don't think that's probably the greater feeling there, and again, certainly Hamas does represent a radical Islamic party. They're not. With that said, they are more pluralistic than Israel is. I mean, for example, Christians were not attacked by Hamas inside Gaza or the West Bank, right? They do feel protective of the Christians there, but they definitely, their goal, Hamas, is more of a caliphate, so that would not be amenable to what we believe in as Marxists, right? But there are Marxists, plenty of Marxists to work with in Palestine. That's my long and short of it, anyway.
Thank you, Dan. So now on the stack is Sharat, Donna, Janet, Laura, followed by Youssef, and Sharat, it's all yours now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, David, for your courage in going to the West Bank at this moment. I wanted to make two comments, and I was going to ask a question, but you partially answered. But I'll make the comments anyway. So first of all, about genocide, I just wanted to point out that the other very important aspect of the definition of genocide, and it's not just a mass killing, but the original definition by Raphael Lemkin in 1948 was a determination of the intent. And so the perpetrator of genocide, by that definition, has the intent at ethnic cleansing, at the intent of erasure of an identity. And I think that, that makes it so much more draconian. And indeed, Israel has this intent. I mean, we see all the evidence in the current Netanyahu government that has been in power particularly since the government of November last year, has the intent at squeezing the Palestinians in Gaza, in terrorizing people in the West Bank. My other comment is that recognizing that the Hamas attack on October 7th was probably, I mean, in terms of the timing, has more to do with a response to what's been happening in the West Bank, the acceleration of the settler attacks, the frequency and the severity of the raids into Jenin, Nablus, Tulkarm, all of this happening, over the past year, meant that some kind of response by the Palestinians had to take place. So those are my comments. My question was whether you had some, and you partially answered this, whether you have some sense of public opinion in the West Bank as to whether public opinion is shifting as a result of this crisis. Are they looking for new leadership? Is Fatah losing any more popularity? I mean, where is public opinion going in the West Bank? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, they are losing popularity. As is Yasser, the Yasser Arafat is being remembered in a less positive way because he was the one that agreed to Oslo. As one woman told me, she said the result of the Oslo Accords was more destructive than the Nakba. Okay, so that says a lot to you. And the Fatah still is holding on to the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution. And I think most people in the West Bank just don't believe that's viable. And again, they believe that the Fatah party is not representing them in any kind of way, is not defending them. They do not defend them against military incursions by Israel. The Palestinian Authority police arrest Palestinians on behalf of Israel. As I said, they're suppressing pro-Gaza demonstrations, and believe me, everyone in the West Bank is sympathetic to the Gazans. So I think Fatah's days are numbered, or certainly this leadership, the Abbas leadership, is done. I think he's seen as a joke. And again, I think while you see a lot of images of Yasser Arafat, and he has a big tomb there, by the way, a big park and a tomb, I think people are looking back at him a lot more negatively, at least in his latter years when he agreed to Oslo, which was very damaging, I think, to the Palestinian struggle. So I do think I think opinion is changing there, and I do think the days of Fatah are numbered for sure.
Okay. I think that Donna Wallach was next, but I don't see her up on our hand up right now. So I'm going to go to Janet Coburn, who made an attempt to get into Gaza, but not very successful, but not because of her attempts, which were very heroic, but unsuccessful ultimately. Janet?
Yeah, thank you, Roger. And thank you, Dan, so much for your presentation today and for your work. I want to start by giving some references to international law that Israel has been violating for decades. The Israel propagandists and the US are talking about reoccupying Gaza. However, the UN still considers Gaza and the West Bank and the Golan Heights to be occupied Palestinian territory going back to 1967. Per Article 4 of the Fourth Geneva Conventions of 1949, Palestinians are protected persons. Part 2, general protection of populations against certain protection of populations against certain consequences of war, spells out what the protections are. So not only does an occupier, in this case Israel, not have the right of self-defense against the people it occupies, it is required to protect them. Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention bans collective punishment. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Conventions say the settlements are illegal. To quote, the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. End quote. Let me add that from the phrase "from the river to the sea" originated with the Likud Party's original party platform from 1977. I'll post a link to that in the chat. I'd also like to say that it's important for everyone to provide attributions and not use the passive tense about who the perpetrator is. So, for example, X number of Palestinians have been killed. You have to say have been killed by Israel. Families who have had members arrested by Israel. You have to attribute. To really make it more accurate and powerful. That said, Dan, could you talk about the Nuremberg principles and how they apply to what the IDF has been doing? And then finally, I am wondering, did you get a chance to go to Bethlehem and possibly see Mazin Kumsia, or to the Freedom Theater in Jenin, which was just raided by the IDF and its director detained? I'll stop.
Okay. Yeah, I did not make it to Jenin, unfortunately. It was, my host did not feel it was safe to go to Jenin, given what was happening there, which is the violence that the Israeli forces are bringing upon that. I did make it to Bethlehem. I did not make it to what you suggested. I did made it to a refugee camp. First, I went to a refugee camp just south of Bethlehem, which was pretty amazing, and a youth center by the way, it's a leftist refugee camp. And in fact, in the youth center, they have a big picture of Che Guevara there. And it's a very ideologically developed refugee camp. And the guy told me, in fact, they have virtually no crime in the refugee camp because it has this real working class solidarity. The only crime is when Israeli troops invade and arrest people, kill people and all. So that was a very interesting part of my trip. And I did make it into Bethlehem proper, where the Church of the Nativity is, that I visited, in Manger Square. So that was, for me, a pretty amazing thing. What was your other question? I'm sorry. You had another...
the Nuremberg principles.
Yeah, well, Nuremberg makes, for the first time in history, makes individuals liable for war crimes against humanity, genocide, and of course, the Nazis and the leaders of Japan who were involved in their war crimes, of course, in the Holocaust, were tried individually for their crimes. This was the first time this concept of individuals being held for state action came into being. And the Genocide Convention, which came after that, also holds individuals liable for genocide if they are involved in it, if they aid and abet genocide. Aiding and abetting liability was created also by the Nuremberg principles.
How about following the orders of your superior?
Yeah, well, that is not right. As we know, under Nuremberg, that is not an excuse. It could be a mitigation in terms of sentencing, but it is not an excuse. If you are involved in, again, enumerated crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, or aggressive war. That's the other thing we need. That's one of the things that's often forgotten about. Aggressive war is contemplated in Nuremberg, and that is the unprovoked invasion of a foreign country. And also the other thing interesting that Nuremberg found to be a crime is war propaganda, which seems to me a lot of network news people could be found guilty of under the Geneva Conventions, and people often give the example that Joseph Goebbels killed his whole family and himself as the Allies entered Berlin because he knew he would be tried for his crimes, though he didn't kill one person. But he was guilty of war propaganda, and he knew that that was a crime, that he incited crimes. And again, there's a lot of that guilt to go around. The other thing, again, to remember is that the wanton destruction of food and food supplies, leaders were tried for that, including in Japan. And we're seeing that happen again in Gaza, where, water supplies have been destroyed, food supplies, the denial of food and water, all of those are war crimes, of course, and individuals can be held to account for that. And again, as the Center for Constitutional Rights, its lawsuit is alleging, people in the Biden administration could be held, individually liable for aiding and abetting these crimes that Israel is carrying out. So all of those could be powerful tools against what's happening here. And of course, all that does come from Nuremberg. Though again, sadly, the main body tasked to enforce those things now, the International Criminal Court, is completely hijacked by the United States and has spoken very little about what's happening, much to its great disgrace, I think. But all those things are, part of the law now through the UN Charter and various conventions, again, including the Genocide Convention.
Thank you.
Okay. Now up is Laura Wells, please.
Hi, Dan. Thank you
Hi,
so much
Laura.
for this and for your work internationally. I have a couple of questions. One is just about, it's sort of related to the cancel culture. I hadn't read the book, but I saw an interview by you about that. And it seems that in these times, people are more and more drawing a line and saying, if you agree with me, you're my friend. And if you don't agree with me, you're no longer my friend. I appreciated actually the fact that I don't think that you used the word genocide. And so I'm curious about how you feel about using that, applying that to this situation. And also the global South, what do you think about that? Latin America and Africa, all the what people would call the global majority, who see what happened on October 7th as an act of resistance that an act of resistance against the imperialism of the US is inspiring. It is something that people like to see, an act of resistance. And so that's it. The word genocide, losing friends, and the global South attitudes.
Yeah, well, I've certainly lost my share of friends over this issue and the Russia-Ukraine issue. And I think by and large, it wasn't because I turned my back on anyone, but they turned their backs on me. I try to keep dialogue open with people. I do agree that it's tough with this issue to be, what I'm seeing in Gaza is so horrifying to me. It is a little hard for me to. I want to have a friendly engagement with a friend, who might defend what's happening there, because I think it's indefensible. But still, I've tried my best not to burn bridges with people when I can prevent that, and try to maybe say nothing to people until we can have a rational discussion about things. I think very few people are beyond redemption as far as I am concerned. But again, we can't help if others decide to turn their backs on us, and I guess we just have to bid a fond farewell. I certainly am not going to give up my principles to maintain a friendship. That's for sure, because that's not a friendship. I do believe this is a genocide, just to cut to the chase. I mean, and I am arguing that in my book for reasons that have already been said. I forget, one of the people asked the question, rightly said, there's two components to genocide. One is intention, and that's true in criminal law in general. You have a mens rea. That's intention. So the intention would be to destroy in whole or in part, it doesn't have to be in whole, or in part, a racial, ethnic, religious, national group. Okay? Palestinians are a national ethnic group. There's no dispute about that. Do the Israelis intend at this moment to destroy in whole or in part that group? Absolutely. And we know this from a lot of statements being made by Netanyahu and other people in his government. They talk about wiping out Gaza. They use dehumanizing language, which is evidence of a genocidal intent, that these are human animals. One minister even said to call them animals is that's an insult to animals. They've talked about turning Gaza into a parking lot. One minister said they should just nuke Gaza. I mean, they're talking about destroying the Palestinians in Gaza, at least in part, if not in whole. But also, if you look at how they're conducting the war, which is also can be evidence of genocide, where they really are targeting civilians. There have not been civilians killed at this rate in any conflict in the 20th century, including World War II. Okay, this is a unique thing that we are seeing. There's very few soldiers being killed, right? The armed combatants of Hamas. Most of the people killed are women and children. And that appears to be by design. And that is evidence that they are trying to wipe out them as a people. I mean, I have no doubt that's the intent. So what are the actions that can constitute genocide? As I mentioned, killing members of the group, check. They're killing a lot of the members of the group. Seriously injuring members of the group. Well, that's happening. Again, destroying the material basis of life support for the group. That's being done. They're denying, since October 7th, they've been denying the Palestinian people in Gaza food, water, electricity, medicine. It's now over 2 months they've been doing this. And intentionally, they have destroyed food and water supplies that are being brought in through the Rafa crossing. They are destroying hospitals. They have destroyed a significant amount of hospitals in Gaza. They have destroyed UN shelters, UN refugee shelters. They are targeting not just civilians, but the things needed to sustain human life there. That is genocide. This is a textbook case of genocide, and that's a quote from a number of legal experts. I have no doubt this is a genocide. If this is not genocide, there is no such thing. I'll go so far as to say. Again, as a legal basis. So, and then was there a third third question as well?
The global South, the reaction of the other countries.
Yeah, I mean, of course, they one have great sympathy with the Palestinian people as a colonized and oppressed people, and of course, they see October 7th as a form of resistance to that. Now, we don't have to like every part of what that entailed, though it seems that as evidence emerges that about two-thirds, in fact, by Israel's own count, 2/3 of the people killed on October 7th were armed people, were military people. And some of the worst allegations against Hamas and its related militants appear not to be true. The killing of the 40 babies, the mass rapes, that doesn't appear to be true. When people engage in resistance, the truth is we don't often like how it looks. I mean, and that was true in South African apartheid. Don't you remember Winnie Mandela? They would, they used the necklaces, they put a tire around someone they thought was a traitor around their neck and burn it on fire. None of us liked that sort of thing. But, resistance takes sometimes ugly forms. I mean, I often point to the case of John Brown. Does anyone not like John Brown? I mean, there's even paintings of him in government buildings in Kansas. I mean, he would murder entire families of slave owners. I mean, that's the truth. He was a terrorist. I think he was a self-proclaimed terrorist, in fact. But everyone seems to like John Brown. And again, I'm not, defending that, but I'm just saying, like, resistance can be kind of ugly. But clearly what happened on October 7th was a form of resistance. And again, as the evidence comes out, I don't think it was as untargeted as originally claimed. Certainly it's more targeted than what Israel's doing to Gaza, right? If you look at the proportion of civilians being killed on both sides, it's not even close. Hamas was much more targeted in going after armed actors. We also know that a lot of civilians killed on October 7th were killed by friendly fire by the Israelis themselves, either out of panic or carrying out this Hannibal directive, right, where they will not allow people to be captured as hostages because they don't want to trade hostages. So in any case, so I'm not surprised that the third world, and I know that term's not used anymore. I like it. I always honored the third world, and I don't see that as a pejorative term. So, but the third world is definitely in support of the Palestinian people because they've been there. And the South Africans are more as supportive of them as anybody because they know that what is happening in Israel-Palestine is a worse form of apartheid than they suffered. And why? Because the white minority, yes, they oppressed Black people in South Africa, but they needed them to work. They didn't want to destroy the Black population. That's not true in Israel. They want to destroy the Palestinian people and get rid of them in a way the white settlers in South Africa did not intend. It is much worse. And that's just objective. I mean, that's just so clear. It's ridiculous. But anyway, those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Our last two questions will come from Yosef and Alan, and then we'll give Dan a chance to sum up. So, Yosef, it's all yours.
Thank you. I just about agree with just about everything you said, and I think you have done a very thorough job. However, I will take some exception to the Israeli Communist Party. It does represent very well the Palestinians within Israel. And I think that's and the Palestinians themselves recognize this. I saw them interacting in world forums. They've mixed. They've been welcomed very much among the Palestinian and Arab communist parties and organizations, anti-imperialist organizations. It's true that the soft Zionist left has disappeared, but the Israeli Communist Party, which is I think, quite a principled party, has a very good following among the Palestinian citizens of Israel and some Jewish citizens as well. It's an equality.
I just want to thank you for that, Yusuf. You probably know more than I do, and I'd say if I had any regret, I didn't get to meet anyone in the Communist Party there, at least not that I knew of. Maybe I met communists who didn't own up to it. But I wish I had, because I'm glad to know what you said. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm a communist. I want to work with communists, and next time I go, I'll meet communists there. So thank you, Yusuf. Appreciate you.
Alan, it's your turn.
Dan, I want to thank you for coming and speaking today. Your talk has been tremendously valuable. Your report back and your on-the-ground observations, I think, hopefully this will get out as widely as possible. I had a couple of issues I wanted to circle back with you about. One of them is the question of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And the claims of the Zionists are not just that criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic, but denying the idea of a Zionist state, an exclusively Jewish state in Palestine, is anti-Semitic. And I wanted to ask you about other angles for approaching that question. One of the things that comes to my mind is the idea that Israel is a settler colonial state. And the realization of the national aspirations of the Jewish people, quote unquote, according to the Zionists, necessarily implies the denial of the national rights of another group of people. So in that sense, it's not just that we're criticizing Israel, but it's also that the claim of the Zionists for national identity of the Jewish people is actually not valid on that basis. I wonder if you had other ideas about that. The second question.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, you can.
Well, I just say, I mean, I think on its face it fails in the sense that we don't accord that right to anyone else. I mean, we don't, right? Again, we don't think if you, again, everyone, at least after 9/11, our biggest fear was someone was going to set up an Islamic caliphate somewhere where, again, everyone would have to abide by some radical form of Islam upon the pain of imprisonment or death. No one thinks that's a good thing. Okay, in that realm, no one thinks that Germany had a right to have a a pure Christian German national identity, which excluded Jews and Gypsies, and that. No one believes that. Like, no, we don't believe that for any other people. Why should we believe it in this instance? It leads naturally to what we're seeing, towards this horrible violence. The only way that Israel justifies that is by claiming that they are a superior people to the Palestinians and by dehumanizing them. And it's the only way anyone has justified that sort of monolithic state. And that's why it's indefensible. It, by definition, will lead to violence against another people. And that's what we've seen for 75 years there. And that's what we're seeing in huge numbers now. So I think that just fails on its face, when you talk about it.
My second question, which I think this is a really good point to wrap up on, is to revisit the question of the tectonic shift that you alluded to earlier in the Q&A. And I've been reading some of the commentary by Hassan Nasrallah from Hezbollah, which I would highly recommend to people. You have to really struggle to find it. I've seen it on RT, people from Hezbollah, and basically on Telegram. That's the only place you can really get it. And he's basically saying, and a lot of people are saying on the ground, that the Israeli military operation is not succeeding. Yes, there's a lot of slaughter taking place, but the political costs are untenable for the Israelis. Can you comment on how this thing is unfolding in terms of the military situation and how it could end up making this tectonic shift, turning it into a real earthquake for Zionism and U.S. imperialism?
Absolutely. First of all, I listened to both of his big speeches. I, kind of dropped even when we were in Cairo, we all dropped what we were doing and ran to the TV to listen to him. I mean, he's a serious individual. Hezbollah is a serious organization. I think it's a very ethical and national liberation force that demands being taken seriously. And I think he is right that, and I've been listening a lot to Electronic Intifada and some other, on some Telegram sites of the resistance. And when you bore down to what's happening, Israel militarily is losing this war, okay, and economically. Economically, let's start there. They're losing billions of dollars, okay? And what Yemen is doing now, forcing all the shipping of Israel to and from Israel around the entire continent of Africa will cost them billions of dollars. Meanwhile, I mentioned all of these settlers, tens of thousands of settlers have been internally displaced. Well, those were working people who were creating value. They're not creating value now. Now they're welfare recipients, right? That's costing money. 500,000 settlers just left overnight. That's costing money. Israel is economically bleeding, and they cannot sustain this for much longer. Janet just said, and they're losing morally. Of course, they have lost the moral high ground in a way we've never seen in 75 years. The mask has fallen off, and that is significant. But militarily, I'll tell you a story. A journalist told me this in Palestine. Nice guy. And he was saying, he showed me a little circle and he said, when the humanitarian pause started, like whatever time it was supposed to start, 8 a.m. or whatever, he said in Gaza City, around Gaza City, the Israelis had circled. And the moment the humanitarian pause started, the Palestinian militants arose from underground, confronted the Israeli troops around and stole their flags as a sign to say, you have gained no ground at all and you don't even know it. We have this place completely in our control. Militarily, Israel is losing this. 70% of the Israeli forces have actually left Gaza because they cannot fight the militants hand to hand and man to man, and they know it. And that this orgy of violence against the civilians in part is them flailing because they cannot win militarily. They are losing to Hezbollah in the north. They will lose to Hezbollah in the north, just like they did in 2006. The Yemenis are hitting them in the south from time to time. They cannot win this. They cannot sustain this. And Hezbollah hasn't even taken off the gloves yet. And Iran hasn't taken the gloves off. The mounting anger in the Arab world, in Jordan, in Egypt, for example, in the Gulf states, will not be able to be put back. That genie will not be put back in the bottle. Governments will fall over this. Pro-U.S. governments will fall over this. The deals that have been made with the U.S. and Israel are going to be broken in a big way. Israel, the leadership, I'm certain, is deathly afraid of this moment. And that's why, while on the one hand, it's important to look at the human suffering that's happening in Gaza, be aware of it, fight against it, it is also important not to lose hope. The history is on the side of the Palestinian people, and they will win this. Now, there's going to be a lot of loss in the meantime, but they are going to win. And when you see, I'll end it with this. I saw a video, you've probably seen videos like this too. I saw this girl, this Palestinian girl, she's probably 10 years old, pulled out of the rubble. And they said, are you going to leave Gaza? She says, I'm never leaving Gaza. This is my home. And if they kill me, I will be a seed that is planted of the resistance. If you have a 10-year-old girl pulled from rubble who puts her fist in the air when pulled from the rubble, that is a people that cannot be defeated. They will not be defeated. We will not be defeated. We cannot lose heart. And as long as they keep fighting, we need to keep fighting. And I'm saying this because I have never felt so engaged in a struggle in my life. If you have any gas left in your gas tank, if you have any bullets left in that chamber, this is the time to fight and give everything you have to fight this abomination that we're seeing, but also to fight for a liberation that I think is within reach. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And I think we'll leave with that. It was a very moving final statement. Free Palestine. Thank you very much.
Free Palestine. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you. Thank you, Roger. I appreciate you, man. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Peace.
Thanks, everybody.